Are y'all still in the room?
What to do, they're streaming it into another place.
I think we just lost your audio.
Some people are sitting in the health science building, I think it's called.
We got it here.
Good morning, everyone.
Come on.
We have a rule and policy here at the library. No food and drink are allowed in the auditorium. So please, you gotta go outside.
Okay.
Will do.
Thank you.
No food or drink.
How are you guys doing this morning?
Doing well, ma'am.
Fanny Cox?
No food or drink in the
I'm Josh
auditorium,
Ash.
so.
Nice to meet you, Josh.
Nice to meet you.
Will you guys be joining us for lunch?
I will have it.
Okay. Well, let me get, well, you already got a bag. You already have a bag. I'll go give you a name tag. But,
Hey, we're good. Is it back there?
yeah, I mean, it's okay.
Oh, we'll use from the
I'll
restroom.
take care of you.
Okay.
No,
Thank you.
you're special.
Get it from the restroom? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So, and y'all learned it, Brian? No food and drink.
Oh. Turn around.
Remind people, please, because Josh,
So I'm about to go.
Watch it,
Okay.
you're gonna step in.
Don't need to swear them out.
I actually would prefer that.
Okay.
Anything else?
Hey! Good to see you. Oh, my goodness, I think, will you
I think your
have
daughter-
Blue, my
yeah,
daughter
I was gonna say,
interviewed you.
I think she did. I was gonna ask you about
Yeah,
that.
she,
She's
it
lovely.
was a great, thank you for your time.
Oh, it was
Coming
great.
in, she loved it.
It
She
was
still
great.
talks about it.
I enjoyed it. I see him around all the time. It was a great time.
Oh,
They
great.
did a great job. I was like, wow, they're really good at this. Miss McLaughlin was like, oh yeah, they're very thorough. I mean, they were writing everything down. It was
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah, well, thank you for doing that.
Oh.
Which division are you in?
I actually work on a headquarters. I'm one of the assistant chiefs over.
Oh, that's right, that's right. I'm now a chaplain for the 5th Division.
Oh, excellent. That's where I was a major. So.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
I just met Major,
Callahan?
Callahan.
Yeah.
She's a, that's a
Yeah,
chaplain now.
yeah. I live there and
In the
Victor's still
Highlands.
there. And so
Yeah,
it's, you know, it's
yeah,
always a
yeah,
special
yeah.
place.
I
But
was to a lot, so that's not much fun.
So you all passed
Well, it's
out.
nice meeting you.
it was
Yeah.
nice meeting you as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're better than
Bless
that.
you.
I'm sorry, I get some nuts.
I do too, but it, you know, I do it at the last minute.
Right.
And so I was just telling Francie.
I got stressed out.
I've been thinking that we should step by step, and so I like to take this up.
Yeah, of course.
Four,
You see all these tracks?
yeah, there's 11 of them. So I like to take some of the nieces, great nieces,
Hey!
nephews.
How are
So,
you? How are you?
so I got them all done, I got all it done, and
No,
I just
it was,
really,
I know it can happen, you know, months ago. I can't.
one, and then I was putting my kids to bed, and I came back.
Yeah, it's totally cool, and I was, you know, kind of last minute, but you know, we have like a holiday.
And just lays everything down and just folds it in to a nice little square.
There you go.
drop it in this in case.
I have to, I'll be right back, I have to go to the ladies' room, I don't know how they do it.
I don't either.
My,
I would be so stressed out.
my granddaughter, she can go to Europe with a backpack. I've never seen anything
I
like it.
watched Tracy that she just goes, how can you do it?
Mm-hmm.
Or to Australia and, oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
She's doing to hummus.
We do not have audio from you all right now.
Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Test 1 2.
Oh, cool.
I was like, bro, you don't tell the truth about DHS. You're a part of the Pope.
because there's something to say.
Yeah.
So I have the opposite handicap level, two different, you know, and then wrap it over. She was around,
Yeah, where do I plug in this meeting?
Before everything got really bad, he was the rally leader. Kicked out.
I'm ready to go.
Share this. He said, when I was that age,
Here's my favorite.
I'll bring that up on the major guy. Okay, cool. Right. And then just to make, oh, cool. All right. Well, it'll go how it goes. So listen.
Where they get the giant eagle trainer, giant eagle trainers, and somebody else comes by and
So
she's one
the
for work. This was
20-minute presentation.
so, but she.
He's either behind the podium or right in front of the podium.
I'm gonna.
Yeah. That way you're.
Felt like there was nothing there. That was quiet, enough for over there. So.
Here, I can go and try and see if I can dig one up.
Good morning.
Oh, okay. Because he normally has a class on Wednesday morning, so we'll kind of get some adult ed to kind of work out what you're saying for the morning.
So these are, I can go stay there long, but it's long.
We just have to be us. We'll just make them all sit like that. It's okay if I sit here, right?
We'll be good.
Oh, yeah. Here, have a seat. Oh, that's right. Here's your, what you got. Great, thanks. I want to introduce you to Chris. Okay. Bailey, listen, look at, see this? This is the thick part sitting on the bottom. You see these little pieces
You're
that's
gonna wear
thin?
them for more than just
And this is the bottom. You see what I'm talking about? Look at this, when you open
But
it,
it's not exactly.
you know, it's just thick. See how this is thin? You're about to open it like this. Have it that way. Right here. don't you know, but Mark,
You read those articles?
he's still running.
Like, Washington, those like drafted material.
In case you don't know, Tom, the auditorium is on the lower level. So the temple's bus went to Goshen.
Not by me.
I got a text from my wife, the bus was running late, he went to Goshen. So they
They
did.
took a wrong turn. Yeah, they took a way wrong turn. They went out 42 in the wrong direction.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah,
right.
that was a definite wrong turn.
Right.
Somebody should have spoken up way before they got to Goshen.
Well, I think it was just the bus driver.
I know, but somebody should have said, oh, hey.
But how would the bus
Oh,
driver?
you mean like the bus?
They're taking a bus, they rented a bus.
I understand that, but did they take the?
No, the bus guy went to Goshen, and I think he's going to the temple.
Oh.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. I thought I was saying a bus full of people from the
No,
temple
no,
said,
no.
you're going the wrong way.
Um,
Oh, yeah. Well, that's not good. We had government this holiday, we got a sorority advisor coming to us, you know, for advice. There was Indiana University Bloomington and there's Indiana University Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And they sent her to Pennsylvania by mistake, so she was a little late getting out.
right.
When did you get here?
I'm a week and a day.
Okay.
Anyway, I came, a week ago Tuesday, but I came at 9. I didn't get in until after 9. Sure.
Have you seen?
I mean,
I was just saying, I was gonna
Yeah, it's got a list of winter and you got one of the contacts, right? All of it.
It feels like fall.
You load those on.
I'll
put them on with that.
Thank you for that warning.
How are you?
I'm fine, how are you doing?
She'll chase you out of here with that coffee.
I just got word.
Yeah.
Hey, she met. So this, four. You did. She's one of mine.
She is wonderful, thank you. She's in camp today with class and our grandson.
Oh,
Somebody
It's
said.
good stuff, yeah.
tell her I
I
said
didn't know
hello.
what it was.
Good to see you.
And I could see this again. She's kind, this is my mom, she's visiting from New Jersey, about how do you do? It's so nice to
Well,
meet you.
they all say that. I'm not sure that it's always true.
Well,
Good to
with
see
me
you.
it is.
Okay.
It certainly is.
Good to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Yeah, it's, ever since this, my mother used to go home and she it watches his wings for a long period of the day. And I just came along with it.
I heard that.
So if you want to, you have to have a PowerPoint.
Is the soul,
Get to take the same kind of. And so everyone on the live stream,
along
you
my
can see
cities,
just the results of the history of the tree.
Yeah, and I should be done by specific standards. So, yeah, so it takes me about, so, I work with speed.
They won't see, I don't think they see us, we usually share, I believe those will see.
Yeah, so it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, yeah, the mayor's like, I don't understand. You know, like,
a friend of mine was actually supposed to do that for a South Street.
I'm hoping to have,
I've heard, but I don't know.
thumping and 0-0.
We have an opportunity to meet Sheriff's Office.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know, y'all know each other, okay?
Well, we met, but also, my daughter, so she volunteered at the time at Blue Mountain Elementary School where my daughter goes. Because they were really heroes in the community. And it turns out that my daughter interviewed. Right, and they did it to the whole.
Small town USA, here we are.
That's great.
So we had, yeah, so thank you.
I just want to make that connection for you.
And I met Major Howard last week.
Excellent.
And so I'm gonna be doing a roll call, like Keisha and I are gonna be setting up a date in, November.
Good.
Which is coming up, and I'll go to the different roll calls and just have an opportunity to meet. And I had one call out since I saw you. So,
Thank you for that. I hope that
well,
went well.
I mean, it was a sad situation, but I feel like it, and Jim came in.
We never tell you to come to the parties, right? Something bad. Thank you for that.
Well, my pleasure.
Legendary
We have not started yet.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Y'all can do better than that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. I want to welcome you all to the University of Louisville. And you're at our main library here, Extreme Library. And my name is Fanny Cox. I'm a librarian here and a faculty member in the libraries. And I'm also the programming chair for CODRA. CODRA is for President's Commission on Diversity and Racial Equality. Annually, we do signature programs. The purpose is to educate our students, our campus community, so when we can have programs that we can also include our external community, we do that as well. And this is one of those programs. Because as you know, we are a state-funded institution, and we do try, because of our community engagement goal, we really want to be a part of our community. And again, this is an opportunity for us to not only educate our students, faculty, and staff, but also the community that we work within. So with just a few housekeeping rules, as you know, we are a library, and as the librarian, we have no food and drink in our auditorium. There's a couple of rooms that we don't do that either, but once you get out of here, you're fine. Throughout the program, we're going to have different speakers. We have index cards, so if you want to ask questions, we'll have that index cards and pencils available for you to ask our speakers questions. And let's see. Oh, this is also being recorded. So we hope we'll be viewing this, for future reviews later amongst our students, faculty, and staff. Actually, the community as well, if they would like to see it. And perhaps KET. So if you ask any questions or anything, just be mindful that when you ask or participate, that you are giving us the permission to use your likelihood on TV. Okay, just be mindful. Throughout the day, if you have your program, you see that from 11:45, we're going to shift to the classrooms on the second floor. You'll get your lunch out here, and then you'll go up to the classroom where each of our plenary speakers will have their own classroom, so you can continue the discussion with whomever you decide to continue the discussion with. And if you have any questions, I'm here. We have several CODRA members. Many of us have our little, well, I don't have mine on, name badges that says CODRA or something by University of Louisville from my departments, which have you. And without any further ado, my fellow co-organizer, Martin, many of you already know Martin Brooks. It's been a great adventure putting this together. I've done 8 national conferences, but not one here at home. So it's a very different kind of thing to do one at your home institution. So Martin, come on up.
Let's see, I think there's a microphone here that, is this projecting? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, excellent. Fanny, thank you so much. This program would not have happened without Fanny and her resources here at the library. She's just been so crucial to pulling all the details together. And the people who do the mics and the cameras, we're simulcasting this down to the medical campus, so you can imagine the logistics of getting something like that set up. And Fanny and her team, the teams here at U of L, have just been wonderful to hammer through all of those details. Thank you for making the effort to come this morning. We're going to have people coming and going a little bit through the day. There are classes that will join us. There is a busload of people coming from the temple, and apparently the bus went to the wrong location to pick them up. So they are running a little bit late. My phone just dinged, so if you don't mind silencing your phone so we don't interrupt the process, that would be good. You are at the Fighting for Peace, Countering Hate, Violence, and Extremism. So this is going to be a conference today. We're going to discuss the causes, effects, and solutions to violent extremism. Nothing wrong with having extreme ideas, but when it moves into violence, that's what we want to talk about today. And how do people get involved in that? And how do we help them get out of that? Is it systemic things, or is it a decision that people make? But our speakers will talk about all of that today. I want to take just a moment to thank our sponsors. As I listed them, we ended up having 10 different organizations that help finance and are behind this. Just let me read those off to you. The Jewish Heritage Fund for Excellence provided a big chunk of the funding for the program, so we're very grateful to them. Temple Shalom, Rabbi Beth Chotner is here with us today. They are going to host tomorrow evening one of our plenary speakers, Rashawn Abbas, is going to be out at Temple Shalom tomorrow evening, so if you want more, there's another opportunity for that. The Temple, whose bus is running late this morning, Muslim Americans for Compassion, the American Turkish Friendship Association, the University of Louisville Libraries, U of L School of Medicine, the U of L Office of the Provost, U of L Commission on Diversity and Racial Equality, which Fanny told you about a little bit earlier, CODRA, and my organization, Peace Catalyst International. A little bit of the background of this event. Peace Catalyst received a grant under the Obama administration from the Department of Homeland Security. And this conference today is an outgrowth of that grant. We initially had a conference at Duke University, and then we did another one in Seattle at a retreat center there. And some of the things that we learned through this multi-year process, we wanted to bring to Louisville, some of the speakers that we encountered. So an overview of the day, you're going to hear from our plenary speakers first in the morning. I'll introduce the speakers later. But you're going to hear from our plenary speakers this morning, first from a report about the Uyghur people of Western China, a Muslim minority group that's being incarcerated in record numbers since World War II. There has not been this many people incarcerated because of their ethnicity in the world. Between 1 and 3 million people are the numbers. I think Rashawn last night was telling me it's 3 million people are incarcerated in re-education camps is what China is calling them. After that, we're going to hear from Jesse Morton, who was a former recruiter for Al-Qaeda, and he'll talk about what he looked for, how he recruited people, and his journey into and out of that world. Then that will be followed by Tony McAleer, who was one of the co-founders of Life After Hate, former white nationalist, and he'll talk about his journey into and out of white nationalism. So listen carefully to those three speakers. After they speak, we'll have a moderated discussion where you can ask questions as part of that moderated time. Then we're going to go to lunch, and at lunch you'll have the opportunity to eat with one of the three plenary speakers. So if you want to go more in depth with one of them, you get to choose which room you go to. Lunch will be catered by Masala Grill. Even if you didn't sign up for lunch, I think there's going to be plenty. So if you would let the people who signed up go first, but then afterwards I think there'll be enough to go around. Then after lunch, we're going to have a religious panel. Rabbi Chotner is going to be one of the speakers on that panel. We'll have Imam Wasif Iqbal, and then we'll have Pastor Tyler McKenzie. Will represent three faith perspectives on how do we approach, how do the religious communities, how are they affected by and how do they approach violent extremism. Then after that, we're going to have a city panel to discuss both from a law enforcement perspective and from a systemic perspective. What can we as a city do to address or be aware of violent extremism in our area? So that's the overview of the day. In the evening, there will be another session at the medical campus downtown, but our day will end about 4 o'clock. I'm hoping that you can stay with us through most of the day. I know people will have to come and go a little bit as the day goes on. At this time, I'd like to invite Brian Warren up, and he works with the Office for Globalization in the mayor's office. He, too, has been a critical part of organizing this. It's like, Brian, who do I get to talk about this? And he knows everybody in the city. So he has been a great help to me. And Brian, I'll let you give a welcome.
Does this one work over here, or is just this one?
Well, they're for different purposes.
Okay.
This one does the work.
All right, well, I'll stand over here. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invite to come to give some opening remarks to this, I think, very important conference and discussion today. I have a really interesting day. Starting with this, then I'm going to take a break, and then I'm going to be going down to the Kentucky Center to hear Violins of Hope. And this is a project that's in the city right now. It's a bunch of violins that had been confiscated by the Nazis in World War II from Jews. And they've been refurbished and made playable again. And they're on display at the Fraser Museum. But people in the community are actually going to play them and bring them back to life. And it's a wonderful way in which we can tell the story of those that lost their lives to a form of violent extremism. And so it's interesting to have these two things kind of bookending themselves today for me, because as someone who works in the Office for Globalization, the national rhetoric, the politics that are going around the world with populism, nationalism, I think are fueling a kind of hatred and an extremism that is leading itself to not only individual acts of violence, but structured violence across the globe, which is putting people at risk. And I would say here in Louisville, you know, we like to imagine that we're immune to all of those things, but we're not. We're seeing this manifest itself in a number of ways in the city. There's been 2 defacements of religious institutions in the city, a mosque down on River Road, and then most recently, over the last year, a Hindu temple down in the Buchel area. We've seen the Castleman statue, you know, defaced after the Charlottesville riots, you know, a response to an extreme convening of people in Virginia, and the dialogue that has ensued around that conversation. And then most tragically here in the Louisville area, the loss of the life of Maurice Stallard and Vicki Lee Jones at Kroger, an individual, you know, seeking to commit a hate crime against the black community, and unfortunately it found itself happening in Kroger, and it hit most immediately for us in Louisville Metro government because this was the father of our colleague Kelly Watson, who leads our diversity and equity work within city government. So it's personal because it's impacting our community, but it also hits us in a lot of other ways as well. The mayor and my colleagues, I see Chief Conrad here, all of us in Metro government are fully aware that, you know, the way that we combat that here in the city is by, number one, engaging with our communities, coming up with thoughtful plans and policies that are based on our conversations with the community, and we're making attempts, you know, to be a good partner and helping to stem that kind of extremism that's happening in our city. And it's not just folks that take, you know, hate-filled views. We see it manifesting itself with young people who are finding ways to join gangs and use violence to perpetrate, you know, crimes against their neighbors and people in the community as well. The thing that kind of ties all this together is that loss of sense of belonging, right? And what we're finding is that those who wish to create havoc, chaos, and create harm understand this and have become very strategic, extremely sophisticated in how they recruit young people and people who feel disaffected. And the ways that we're going to combat that as a community and as a society is understanding the root causes of that, and then understanding how the groups that wish to cause us harm are using the tools of social media, of psychology, and belonging to advance their causes. And we've done that through some very deliberate programs in the city. And so, for example, the development of the Office for Globalization was designed to take a look at the needs and the issues of our immigrant and refugee communities to ensure that they have access to prosper within our community and become productive residents of the Louisville area. The police chief, you know, we're working with law enforcement to change practice and policy, but also the development of our Office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods. We know, as the chief will tell you later today, we cannot, you know, arrest our way out of, you know, issues within our community. We have to address the root causes that end up driving those young people and people to violence and crime first. And that's the way we're going to make the most substantive change within our community and society. So this conversation, I think, is extraordinarily important today. I'm glad you're here. I see people from the faith community, the nonprofit community, Rhodey Streeters back there from Interfaith Path to Peace. Rabbi, thank you for being here as well. My colleagues at Metro Government, University of Louisville. It takes a whole community, those cross sectors, understanding the problem, coming up with plans, and enacting those within our community. So thank you for being here today. I'm looking forward to learning a lot more about, you know, these issues within the national and international purview, and then figure out how we can bring some of that learning back here to Louisville. So thank you for being here today. Thank you, Martin, for organizing this, and Fanny for pulling this all together at U of L. Have a good day.
Thank you, Brian. And Brian mentioned cross-sector. It really does take the whole city and approaching this from many different angles to address these issues. And that was actually a part of the original grant that we got. We were to intentionally not just talk to law enforcement or the faith community or government, but to try to bring in the different actors that would address these things. We're now going to move into our first plenary speaker, Rashawn Abbas. First, did we get the cards for people to write questions on?
No, I have hand paper.
I'm sorry?
I have pads.
Okay. So if we could pass those out so people could write the questions as they come to mind. And then in a few minutes, Dr. Jason Abbott, or that actually will be an hour, will have the moderated discussion, and we'll field some of those questions as they fit into whatever the way the conversation unfolds. So please come on in, grab a seat. All right, our first speaker is going to be Rashawn Abbas, and we brought Rashawn, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine in Peace Catalyst. Bill Clark is out in Seattle, and he had lived in China and worked with the Uyghur people, and he was a friend. His family was a friend of Rashawn's family. Rashawn is a part of the Uyghur people. Let me just read what I've written here. In 2017, you know what? I have. This is why we have PowerPoint. Hang on. Forgive me as I try to figure out how to work this quickly. And all right, there was a way to share this.
Oh, you want to share it on
Yeah, I just need this one slide. Thank you. Now, perfect. So, this is Rashawn. In 2017, Ms. Abbas founded a campaign for Uyghurs to advocate and promote human rights and democratic freedoms for the Uyghurs and mobilize the international community to act to stop this human rights atrocity. Ms. Abbas has been an ardent campaigner for human rights of the Uyghur people and has worked closely with members of Congress since the 1990s. She's a frequent contributor to the media outlets like New York Times, NPR, USA Today. She has just flown in from the Czech Republic and Brussels, and there was another country we're in, Denmark. So she's an international traveler advocating for the Uyghur people. Unfortunately, many of my friends in Louisville aren't familiar with the term Uyghur. Who are the Uyghurs? And that's one reason we want to highlight the Uyghur people as sort of a case study for as we think about violent extremism for the rest of the day. What is happening in Western China is going to lead to more instability. So I'm going to turn it over to Rashawn. You have about 20 minutes, and I'll hold up the 5-minute sign or so when you're about done.
If anyone has wants to ask questions, we have pads. So this is us right here, and I will pass out papers.
So if you have a question, perhaps raise your hand and. Okay. And we'll get you one of the pads of paper. Did you have a PowerPoint that you need to get? Okay. Can we give Rashawn
Which one was yours again?
It says Rashawn.
There it is.
Yep. Assalamualaikum.
Can you imagine there is a government today outlaw this greeting? Salam alaikum means peace be with you. It's the most peaceful greeting. But in China, the Uyghur people are in the concentration camps today. Some of them is just because they use this greeting to greet each other. And that's being viewed as Islamic extremism. In fact, the entire religion of Islam is being outlawed and being viewed as mental and ideological disease. Many of you probably don't know who the Uyghurs are. I guess I have to stay here to speak. The Uyghur people live in northwest part of China, which you see right up here. It's about 1/6 of entire China, 4 times of California size-wise. And according to Chinese census, they always try to make us less and they hide our population. It's about 12 million, but according to Uyghur census, that spent 250 Uyghur intellectuals on the bike going to town about 5 years ago, and came up with about up to 20 million population. The East Turkestan, the name is used as a symbolic and a historical name, but in the official name is Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Does it work? Let's go switch.
Try again. There you go.
Okay. This is the front of a university, like the university here. It's front of Xinjiang University. And this is how it is. The people are being monitored 24 hours a day. And this is just a regular picture. People are sitting here, students and the teachers, and you see there's the military armed guards sitting with them to listen what they are talking, and like 3 armed guards like that close to each other. It's like a war zone. You probably have read George Orwell's 1984, and you can imagine that's how it is for just daily lives for the Uyghur people. 1984 is written back in 40s, described 35 years before now. This is 2019, 21st century. Yet, this is how the Uyghur people are living at the entire world's watch. What are the Uyghurs? You probably have heard, or if you Google Uyghur, the Uyghurs has been living in Central Asia, and the basically prominent center for the world trade for more than 2,000 years. Original Silk Road where Marco Polo went, that starts from Kashgar, which is the heart of our homeland, East Turkestan. Manchus basically invaded our homeland in 1876 and renamed the territory as Xinjiang, which anybody speaks Mandarin here understand. Xin means new, Jiang means territory, so it's new territory for China. Also, China claims now it has been part of China for 2,000 years. The Uyghurs gained independence twice, established independent country that short-lived in 1933, and the second time in 1944. Since October 1949, it became part of communist China. Ever since the Chinese communist regime's occupation, ever since Mao Zedong's occupation in 1949, the Uyghurs has been faced a different set of labeling Uyghurs in the name of nationalists, counter-revolutionaries during the 60s, and then later separatists. But right after 9/11, the Chinese government just flipped around and became the victims of war on terrorism and labeled Uyghurs as Islamic extremists or terrorists, just because the Uyghur people are Muslim. One of the reasons the Chinese government has been trying relentlessly since Mao's occupation in 1949 is, as you see, rich in natural gas, oil, petroleum, highest the reserves for precious metals and minerals, and it produces 60% of the China's cotton output. And now, Cotton On, Target, H&M, and the Badger Sports has been profiting from the concentration camps, the forced labor, basically modern-day slavery, the people in the camp producing working on production, basically. Why all this happening? 2013, Xi Jinping announced to the world in Kazakhstan, in Astana, his signature project, his dream to the world domination, Belt and Road Initiative. Most of you are probably familiar with what's Belt and Road Initiative, also called as One Belt, One Road, or 21st Century Marshall Plan, New Silk Road, or 21st Grand Strategy. Just different names, all the same. BRI, we call it Belt and Road Initiative. It includes over 700 projects around the world. Airports, seaports, railroads, all kinds of infrastructure projects. Many countries think that if they sign up on the Belt and Road Initiative, they can create jobs, or it benefits the local economy for those countries. Wrong. The Chinese government brings their own workers to each country that they are working on those infrastructure projects. So just a way of colonizing the countries. Who's in it? Looks like 2/3 of the world, basically. This is the map for the Belt and Road Initiative. As you see, from the previous map, you see our homeland, East Turkestan, lies right around here, which the Belt and Road Project puts East Turkestan in epicenter of this plan. So basically, the failure or the winning of this success of this project based upon controlling our region entirely. So as you see, the 3 roads, one to the Central Asia, one to Europe, and the Africa, and the sea road, the CPAC we call it, Pakistan, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, down through Gwadar Port, all goes through our homeland. And it's the gateway to Central Asia and the Europe and the Africa. Therefore, the new Silk Road is being based on destruction of our homeland, and the Uyghur people are being victims. Entire race, entire nation is being the victim of this plan. The outcome today, according to Department of Defense, Randall Shriver said in one of his briefings in Pentagon in May, it's about 3 million Uyghurs in the Soviet Gulag-style concentration camps today. Everything that makes the Uyghur people unique has been treated as a crime. Being Uyghur, being Muslim, is being treated as a crime today. So basically, the option given for the Uyghur people is you live as Han Chinese, you speak Chinese language, you believe in the communist propaganda, the communist ideologies, pledge yourself to the Communist Party, or you die as an Uyghur. Ambassador Cui to the United States in Washington, Chinese ambassador to the United States, shamelessly announced to the world when he was giving an interview on CNN. He said, with those, they call it re-education camps, with those camps, we are making the Uyghurs normal persons. Imagine that. Everything makes Uyghurs unique. Our language, our culture, our history, our religion, being treated by the Chinese communist regime as abnormality. So some of the satellite images. Many people were skeptical about this. Many Chinese people, of course, living in the West. Sean Zhang is a graduate student in the University of British Columbia, lives in Vancouver. He also didn't believe what he was reading. So he did his own study using the open source satellite images. And he came up with all these satellite images he first made to the media. And he confirmed it. There are some of the camps that he listed in our homeland. All these dots are concentration camps. The first camp was opened in Lop Nor in 2014 under the Strike Hard campaign, 5 years ago. It grew 465% in past 20 months. If we look back the history, the Nazi Germany opened first concentration camp in 1933. 12 years later, in 1945, when Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered, and when the world knew what happened, we witnessed 6 million people dying in the concentration camps. And the world stood up and said, never again. Back then, when the Western world continued doing business with Nazi Germany, enabling Nazi Germany's economy to continue those camps, those concentration camps, later blamed on the ignorance. They didn't know it. You can't hide behind ignorance anymore. This is 21st century. This is information era. You cannot say you didn't know it. At the beginning, when it first showed up in the media, called it internment camps. The Chinese government denied, just looking at the world and saying, the camps doesn't exist. There is no such thing. It says, what? What camps? That is a lie. And then at the front of overwhelming evidence, later in August, they said those are the re-education camps. 2 months later, changed the narratives and said those are the vocational training centers. Senator Menendez, when he was giving an interview on CNN, he called rightfully, those are concentration camps. According to testimonies from the former inmates, there are the detainees in the camps going through intense indoctrination, mental and physical torture, forced to take unknown medications, facing rape, food and sleep deprivations, dehydrations, overcrowded rooms, taking turns to lay down and sleep. And they're building crematorias next to the concentration camps. According to government bids, according to news reports from Radio Free Asia, according to job announcements, they are building massive crematorias next to the concentration camps for a culture that doesn't practice cremation. The Uyghurs are Muslims. They don't burn bodies. They don't believe in cremation. They don't practice that. The whole world knows what happened when we saw concentration camps and the crematorias together. That should be the warning sign, but nobody is paying attention. Some pictures. Barbed wires, watchtowers, those are the inside of the camps. Doesn't look like some sort of volunteered re-education camps to me. So, the armed guards all around. People are sitting, being indoctrinated. Some more pictures of the inside of the camps. And these are the rooms that they sit 24 hours, listen to Chinese government propagandas, and sleep in those rooms. Imagine how they lay down and sleep. Look at these people. Look at them. They're like in the cages. This just showed up on YouTube last month. Last month in September. A picture taken and drawn. This was in Korla. It was sometime in summer, I think it's in August 2018. Oops. Shaved head and blindfolded, and those are the Chinese police. And these guys are sitting, and the jacket written Kashgar. So they are moving them from one concentration camp to the other, or who knows where they were taking. That's my sister. She was a medical doctor. She was one and the only closest family member I had. I have been outspoken about this atrocity, talking about the conditions of the camps. I spoke at one of the think tanks in Washington, September 5th, 2018. 6 days later, my sister and my aunt, they live about 1,400 kilometers away from each other. But 6 days after I spoke, this was the title, and that's me speaking here. This is September 5th, 2018. On September 11th, 2018, the Chinese government abducted my sister and my aunt, just as a retaliation for my activism here in America, as an American citizen, exercising my First Amendment rights, expressing my freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Yet, my sister became the victim. Chinese government is basically leaving us with choices of either stay silent about this atrocity, or your family and friends back home pays the consequences. They released my aunt a few months later, but my sister, I had no information of her for past 13 months. Knowing what kind of conditions that people are facing, knowing so many people are dying in the camps, I don't even know if she's still alive or not. This is one of the purchase orders for one of the camps in Hotel in southern part. They purchased these to run so-called re-education centers. Basically, with those camps, China has been able to kill 4 birds with one stone. One, making those 3 million people work on production, so-called the enormous Chinese economy is being supported by those slave laborers in the camps. 2, dislocating Uyghurs from their homes and their neighborhoods for opening a space for Belt and Road Initiative and also the Chinese resettlers. 3, jailing the Uyghur men in the camps and prisoners, forcing Uyghur women to marry Han Chinese with the government gratifications as jobs, money, and housing. If they refuse, then the girl and their families are being viewed as Islamic extremists, refusing to marry Han atheist Chinese because they are too religious to accept such a marriage, putting them to the camps. 4, millions of people being tested, mandatory tested for DNA, and now they are being slaughtered for the human organs. camps are set up for basically the organ farms. Current situation, just for regular people like you and me. Racism and the cutting-edge technologies are being used in combination to exert control over an entire nation. People are living in every corner has ubiquitous cameras, facial and the iris scanning softwares, QR scanning codes on every home, GPS tracking devices on every vehicle. The entire area that you saw, 4 times of California, is being controlled as a police state. Being Uyghur, being Muslim is not a crime, but the Chinese Communist regime is treating as one, collectively punishing the entire nation. Why we are not hearing anything from the world? Trade threats the Chinese government is using, the power of the Belt and Road Initiative, that trap diplomacy. They are investing very heavily in infrastructure projects that the countries they cannot pay the debt back, influencing the manipulation within the UN as the second largest donor. Basically, the Chinese government is becoming the power able to strong arm the world. They are changing the rule of laws. They're changing the entire Western hemisphere. The whole world is standing muted because of Chinese economy and because of the trades. The Uyghur people are becoming the collateral damage for such a short-term politics and the economy. And also, the Chinese government is buying out, bribing the key politicians, media, influential scholars, and the important business people from all around the world, Muslim majority countries, Europe, Africa, Asia, successfully silencing the world. Some pictures of daily lives the Uyghur people are going through checkpoints like you go through at the airports, on every block, every corner. And there are 4, actually, armed guards are standing there. And look at these pictures. Some of the people are in the camps. Intellectuals, professors, university presidents, doctors, business people, famous pop singer known as Justin Bieber of the Uyghurs. And look at this old woman, 90 years old grandma. The 4 policemen came to get her because she prayed. What kind of national security threat a 90 years old grandma is going to be? 500,000 Uyghur kids are taken to state-run orphanages, being raised as Han Chinese. I have to speed up, I have only 2 minutes left. The cultural, historical Uyghur books, Quran, prayer rugs, all being burned. And the Uyghur mosques are either being demolished, 500 years old Uyghur mosque being demolished recently, or changed to nightclubs, bars. This is the airport in Kashgar. For a country, they don't even have a special line dedicated for special needed people in the wheelchair. Yet, they have a dedicated line for organ transfer passengers who's transferring the human organs. And some of the pictures of the Uyghur girls forced to marry Han Chinese. Look at her face, look at her face. This is her wedding day. Do you think she's happy? Look at her. She was crying in this video clip. And being asked, the guy, groom is being asked, how long have you been known? He laughed and he says, oh, months, up to 2 months. And she's crying when he said that. And she's being humiliated and taken to the camp because she had some translation of Quran and just some cultural Uyghur historical books. Wearing a clothes like this is being treated as Islamic extremism because I'm covering my back. On the streets, girls are getting their shirts cut And Han Chinese people, 1.1 Han Chinese people moved in, living in Uyghur homes. Imagine that. You have uninvited Chinese government officials coming in, living in your house, eating with you, sleeping in your bed. Look at that. Making the bed, sleeping in the bed. Just give me 1 more minute to do. This is a place in Korla. It's like a Times Square. And this is the normal times 10, 15 years ago. And look at that, it's like a ghost town. I met her, verified every story she said in a few weeks ago in Turkey. And she's one of the Uyghur prisoners from the camp. And that's what she has been through. Gang rape, forced abortions. Remember that? Alan Kurdi, 4 years old. Imagine, sorry, it's a little traffic here. The Uyghur kid, 2 years old, Rahmatullah Sherbaki. His parents were in the camp. Her body was found frozen to death last December. Nobody paid attention. Another one, just recently. He was drawn to death. His father was, both parents were in the camps. I want to live Deng Xiaoping's word, his plan for the world. He died right now, but this is how the Chinese communist totalitarian regime had the plan for us, for the Western democracy and the values, the changing to what you have seen. What I'm afraid is, if we don't stop this, our today, the Uyghur peoples today, what people are facing today in East Turkestan, in Xinjiang, will be the future for tomorrow. Just imagine what kind of world you will be living for your future generations. Thank you. Sorry I went over.
Wow. Thank you, Rushan. You will have opportunity if you want to ask more questions. Tony, it's Jesse is supposed to be.
Jesse's next?
Is supposed to be next. Oh, you're here. Okay. Sorry. And you left, and I was.
I had to use that.
No, that's okay. So if you first, if you have questions and that you would like, raise your hand, and we'll get you paper to write on so that we can address those during the what is it? The session later. Panel discussion. That was the phrase I was looking for. Also, so you could have lunch with Rashawn, or again, she'll be speaking this evening, and again at the Temple Shalom tomorrow evening. Next, our next speaker is Jesse Morton. Jesse is just getting off an airplane from Turkey. So Jesse is the co-founder and, let's see, as the co-founder and chief propagandist of Revolution Muslim, a New York-based activist group in the 2000s, he helped to insert a narrative of Al-Qaeda and Salafi jihadist ideology into the American ambit. Mr. Morton has a master's degree in international relations from Columbia University, worked briefly at George Washington University's program on extremism, where he focused on issues such as propaganda of terrorist organizations, Islamic and jihadist ideology, countering radicalization and extremism, and promoting disengagement. Mr. Morton is the founder of Parallel Networks, which combats violent extremism through the development of meta-narratives and other creative mechanisms. Will you welcome Mr. Jesse Morton?
There's this one here. So, if you pull up, I was trying to download it. I didn't know what download to do, so I don't know the destination. for the panel. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to Martin and to you for attending. I think that we'll transition now from a conversation about the Uyghur population and the land far away, and I think it's very important for us to recognize that the reason that the Chinese government is mostly able to have gotten away with building this and constructing this massive problem that we have now, which are in fact concentration camps, is because of the way that we have framed the war on terror, where it's very easy to scapegoat Muslims. And it's been very easy to scapegoat Muslims. So one thing we always have to recognize, I think, when we start to decipher and try to figure out how we combat localized threats, it's very easy to take a deficit-based approach to the way we see the problem, where we're looking at the other in a way where they have a problem, and we have to fix their problem, rather than looking at the culture and the context in which extremism flourishes, because it's very easy to look at the other, but it's very hard to look at ourselves. And so one of the things that you'll see is why extremists offer, with my presentation, is why extremists offer a complete alternative to the disenfranchised, to those that feel like they're unrecognized, to those that feel like people don't see the problems that we have within our own selves and how they exploit that. So I think we'll be able to transition that to that conversation about how does radicalization and recruitment work, and then also what we might be able to do to make sure that people in our community feel like they belong, and to identify those that are most susceptible to these mechanisms. Because you'll see that extremists don't just offer one piece of narrative, they offer an entire sense of belonging, purpose, and meaning. And the reason that I know that is because I converted to Islam because I was frustrated with my own situation in life. And then I went on to become a major propagandist, radicalizer, and recruiter, and basically set the stage and the template upon which a lot of the propaganda, even evidence documents that even when we deal with the transition into the far-right threat, a lot of what they're doing, they took from the jihadists. And the way that we, English language speaking jihadists, took messages that were hour-and-a-half-long diatribes from al-Qaeda operatives in caves, they weren't in caves, they were in compounds, but overseas, and turned them into a message that could fit for youth and for Americanized youth. It's almost like Madison making Madison Avenue approach to propaganda if you're going to do it properly in the West. So the context changes, right? So the same processes at work here at home. So I call this presentation Where the Light Enters You. It's from a stanza of a poem from Rumi, who says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And the reason that I call it that is because I think a lot of times we are on the precipice of a breakthrough in our societal structures and the way we understand things. And a lot of that is related to trauma. And in every field of study, we're looking more and more at the role that trauma-informed approaches to dealing with things can have. And I think that my case study is representative of the role that trauma has in transitioning to violent extremism. Because if you look up here on the right, that's Yunus Abdullah Muhammad. That's the name that I adopted as a radicalizer and recruiter. It was actually given to me by a veteran of the Afghan-Soviet jihad. But this is Jesse Morton. Jesse Morton, by all accounts, should have been an all-American boy. I was born to a father that was from right outside of New York City, affluent Jersey boy, who basically was the son of who was supposed to be the youngest Supreme Court justice in the state of New Jersey ever. I'm a direct descendant of John Adams. I go back to the sons and daughters of the American Revolution on my father's side. And my father, due to a death in circumstance in his family where his father passed away during his senior year of high school, had a life crisis, moved to a small town in Pennsylvania where he was going to pursue his studies, met my working class mother, impregnated her, had a baby, probably not the most ideal relationship, and they ended up staying together for a large portion of my youth while he committed adultery and while she beat her children while he was away from the house. And the abuse was very serious, and inside of that abuse I had to take care of a younger sister who was getting abused and was very frail, and so I adopted sort of this archetypal, self-sacrificial, messianic sort of understanding of myself where I have to intervene. And the reason that I say that is because we need to understand that the extremists themselves, they care about their cause, they care about their grievance, but it's their understanding of the cause, the impact that their own background typically has on their brain that makes them susceptible and vulnerable to a very black and white world where complexity scares because they've never had stability and they live in a state of anxiety and fear. So I ran away at 16 years old. I took off to the streets. I joined the Grateful Dead eventually, and I traveled as an ultra-liberal hippie, and I threw myself away. Basically, I was so high-risk prone to abuse myself because I wanted to destroy myself. I didn't love Jesse Morton. And I found a new identity when I converted to Islam after reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. While in jail, I was recruited, so to say, by a Moroccan who was incarcerated for fighting on the streets of Richmond City, Virginia. But he was a veteran of the Afghan-Soviet jihad. And so he was a jihadist, and he told me about how to pray, and he told me about the rules of Islam, and he gave me structure where there was none. When I walked away from him, I completely transformed my life. But at the course of him telling me to go into the shower one day, wash myself clean, that he would give me a new identity when I went and came back out, he gave me a name, Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, and told me about an impending war between haq and batil, truth and falsehood, black and white worldview, that soon, because the Taliban have established Sharia, because it's before 9/11, in Afghanistan, the United States and the West and the Kuffar will have to intervene and talk about prophecy, this utopic caliphate that would come in the future. The black flags had been raised in Afghanistan. They would not be stopped until they reached Israel and Jerusalem. And it was a miraculous sort of presentation that set me off as an individual who's always prone to sort of self-study to gain expertise, and immediately I was consumed in knowledge and information, but prone to confirmation bias because my brain wasn't developed enough to search out for only the information as presented by the jihadists. After 9/11 particularly, it kicked me off. George Bush said, you're either with us or with the terrorists. I felt like society didn't save me. I said, I'm with them, not with you, and expressed it very clearly on the streets. That's me in New York City, preaching for America's destruction and the reestablishment of Khilafah before we even had such thing as ISIS. So this concept of a global jihad is basically, as a great scholar has said, it's not really so much about the radicalization of Islam, but more about the Islamization of radicalism. The youth in my era, due to the controversy and the easy susceptibility to what was started to occur with regard to atrocities, human rights abuses in Iraq, was very valuable in creating a sentiment for those that didn't have a sense of belonging, second-generation immigrants, converts to Islam, to side with the enemy in a black and a white worldview. And so you see the diatribes of Al-Qaeda operatives over here, sort of long, hour-and-a-half long information, very much in Arabic, not translated. What we did in confluence with a number of radical preachers and other activists was we took their message, which was very culturally nuanced for the Middle East, and we transitioned it so that it applied to the Americans. This is American Al-Qaeda and Revolution Muslim. I started an organization after becoming a prominent radicalizer online after I had a disagreement, because a lot of radicalization and recruitment when I started was 2003. But by 2007, right, the situation had transitioned into social media 2.0, but the organization I was working with was prohibiting me from using the internet online because they didn't see the value of the lack of temporal and spatial restrictions that the internet provides, right? And so what we did, me and this individual and a radical preacher from Jamaica who was recently released from prison and who had radicalized some of the 7/7 bombers and went back to Jamaica, which gave him a refuge to preach, is we decided to break off from this group, and basically on the notion that they didn't understand the world was changing and that the internet was the next realm of activity. So we set a template for jihadist propaganda in English. You can see our logos here. We used graphic design, some blogs, some internet websites. But it wasn't just about the information. It was about creating a complete counterculture or a complete network that one could belong to. You could get a sense of belonging, purpose, and significance. It's very important to understand how it works, because even though we talk a lot about online radicalization, the most important component of recruitment is if you can document and use the internet as a tool to convey what's going on offline, right? And so what you do is you have to show activity in the community and document it and monitor it as you go. ISIS is what grew exponentially powerful because not only were they disseminating the ideology, but they were disseminating action on the ground, victory in the battlefield. That's what the intention was of the rally in Charlottesville, was to create this idea of mobilization in the real world and then to utilize the internet to convey it to a broader audience so that it would have reverberatory impact. Another thing that we think about with regard to the online, when I was active, we thought about utilizing social media 2.0. Why is social media important? Because not because it allows you to create access to information that bypasses mainstream media alone, but because of the interconnectivity and the interaction. So it was the comment section on YouTube videos where you'd be doing your real individual one-on-one recruitment. The video would be designed in a way where it was neutral, just a piece of a seed, and then you could progress because we created an ecosystem. This is our website. The website was our main hub, and then we had nodes. We'd use YouTube videos like this one right here. It has over 1 million views today. They can't take it down from YouTube because it doesn't violate their terms of service agreements because we made sure that that was the case. And then it was the comment sections where we post links to other activity on the website, links to others. This is us using Twitter the first year that it came out to threaten the writers of South Park. We also utilize clandestine communication because there's a migration away from platforms, and the people that in the community that are most concerned are oftentimes active at a level when they progress to a degree of radicalization that poses a severe risk for the transition into violence. They're no longer on the surface web, and that's what makes it so hard to distinguish because there's broad groups of radicals in the community, and what we created was we knew that if we could create a broader group of radicals and a very low number of radicals go on to actually become terrorists, we knew that by expanding that ratio, if the percentages stayed the same, then the number of those radicals that go on to commit terrorism would increase. We didn't have to tell people to commit terrorism. We had to follow the rules of the United States free expression, and this is what the alt-right is doing, groups like Proud Boys today. Right? They don't explicitly call for terrorism, but they know that if they can create the division and sow the discord and grow the number of those that will go on to commit violence and continue to fulfill the violent extremist objective is realized. What we utilized was a program that shocked the world when it came out with the Snowden leaks. Everybody was like, what is Paltalk? And even articles are written about this program that nobody knows about, right? Because nobody knew what it was, but what it was the biggest tool in the world for us to radicalize and recruit, because Paltalk is a communication platform that is very similar to the way that ISIS uses what we call Telegram today. A lot of people don't know what Telegram is. Because we're removing videos from YouTube and Facebook, jihadists are migrating to clandestine encrypted platforms. And the situation is one where we have a problem where we can't monitor them there. And so a lot of times when we try to deal with radicalization in general, and we do with it with coercive means, we might diminish the overall pool of radicals, but they use it as fodder to migrate to other platforms where they're harder to monitor and where the justification for the turning point to violence due to the fact that they're oppressed and they can no longer speak is utilized to take that turn. One of the big templates that we established was English language jihadi magazines. What this allowed us to do is show that we were savvy at design, and this was the tool that we used to transition the conversation from Al-Qaeda, the long diatribes, into one that was targeted for the West. We used big graphic design, we used one-page branding, we used memes before they were even popular, and I started them in the United States with two prominent jihadists, Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan, who were later killed with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula by a drone attack. These have become probably the greatest tool of weaponizing propaganda in modern era. We started 4 editions, and then my associates joined Al-Qaeda, and then they launched from Yemen the first edition of Inspire magazine after my organization threatened the writers of South Park and caused international controversy. They launched the first edition of Inspire with the first issue, having a recipe for how to build a bomb in Mom's kitchen. That recipe has been used innumerable times, or attempted to be used innumerable times. The Boston Marathon bombers used it. Later, some of my old associates would start the same iteration, not of Al-Qaeda, but of ISIS with Debik and Rumia. Very important to understand how media covers terrorism, especially at a local level, or how media covers extremism and radicalization. It's not about just creating this space online where people will find you. It's about manipulating the mainstream media by doing provocative things, because the mainstream media loves good ratings. They love violence, they love sex, they love gore. And so when there's a terrorist attack, they're paying attention to it 72 hours straight, all day long. Most people think it's horrid. But for the disenfranchised, it's a way to promote your views. So we would do outlandish things to get on TV, things that we ourselves didn't even really believe in or back up, but we needed to use it as a recruitment tool, because every time we raise a flag that was heinous and they would show us, it would give us millions and millions and millions of views. 95% of the people would disagree, 5% of them would contact us, visit our website, and maybe think about joining us. So So how did I de-radicalize? After I threatened the writers of South Park, I moved to Morocco, where I thought I could flee from U.S. prosecution. It ended up not being the case, but I got to live there for a year. And in living there for a year, I was able to start a process of de-radicalization that I outline on this slide, which basically, I think, details my radicalization, but I put it in principles because I think they're important principles when we think about developing programs for prevention and intervention with regard to reversing the process of radicalization. First, I had a contact with Moroccan millennials during the Arab Spring. When I moved to Morocco, the context was very interesting because it's 2010, and I get there and I start to make money by privately tutoring Moroccan millennial youth who are of the more affluent class, but who want to go to the West to study. I'm a graduate of Columbia University, so I taught them GRE for preparations for master's degree practice. And I found myself, a couple of months after I moved there, shocked when the Egyptians take to the streets and start protesting. And inside of watching those millennial youth aspire for things I had taken for granted my whole life, it didn't change my vision or my commitment to Islam. It changed my belief in the totalitarian approach to implementing social change from top down. I had conversations with people that really were immaculately bright, but that were suppressed inside of their own circumstance. And watching them attempt to wrest themselves and to liberate themselves, and watching the world rally around them for a time, at least the general population of the world, maybe not government, maybe not to authorities, really inspired me. And it planted a seed that made me susceptible to change. I was removed from the network and I started to think twice. Osama bin Laden started to sound a little bit different. I saw a little bit more nuance in that black and white worldview. Unfortunately, fortunately now, I was incarcerated. I was coming out of a mosque in 2011, 2 weeks after Osama bin Laden was killed, and there was a Moroccan authority at the end of the street, and he said, "Are you Jesse Morton?" I said, "No, I'm Yunus Abdullah Muhammad." He said, "Well, it doesn't matter, you have to come with me." And he took me into a Casablanca prison, but while I was there, I happened for one day to meet a preacher. His name was Mohammed Fizazi. I had translated his lectures from Arabic into English and shared them with the world. He was a famous Salafi jihadi scholar, but he was in prison from the time there was a 2003 Casablanca bombing attack. But he had changed. And about a month after I arrived at the prison, they left him out and he started to write op-eds in the mainstream press. Here was my first contact with a former extremist. I'm waiting for extradition back to the United States, and here's the words of an individual I had upheld as a person of truth, writing stuff that makes sense in the press. That, I think, displays the power of utilizing former extremists. Thirdly, 5 months later, I was returned to the United States for incarceration and trial, and I was held in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. There was a kind female guard there that would slip me out 4 days a week for 10-hour shifts and take me to the jailhouse law library, which also housed the regular law library. And that's where I revisited the Enlightenment philosophers. The Encyclopedia Britannica's Great Books of the Western World was a volume on Enlightenment philosophers that I read cover to cover. I started to read the Federalist Papers. I read Thomas Paine. I started to re-identify with Jesse Morton. I started to appreciate the value of the liberal world order that the United States had created post-World War II. I started to value my own society and my own upbringing. I started to be able to look at the abuse of my mother as being a projection onto my society, feeling like they had failed me for not intervening, but being able to step aside from that and realize that that was not the norm, that that happens everywhere, that there's not an idealistic utopia that's ever going to exist, and that I could take that pain and I could still heal myself. I was supposed to do 11 and a half years in prison. I met a female FBI agent who realized that some of my students were traveling to join ISIS. At first, they thought the war on terror was going to wind down, and when I told them that it wasn't and why it would not, and I proved correct, they started to come talk to me. Ended up being cooperating with the FBI based upon the fact that I realized they were not waging a war against Islam and Muslims, that they in fact were just trying to prevent terrorism and people from being blown up on the streets. That allowed me to go on where I continued to be incarcerated, to read the text through a post-Enlightenment lens and to reinterpret Islam for the first time, thinking through it myself, which is all about what the Enlightenment is being able to decide for yourself what you believe in rather than sit under some scholar that has authority over you. I was released on March 1st, 2015, not doing my 11 and a half years because of my cooperation, and I returned to the streets where I became someone who was sort of trying to re-enter society and had a very difficult time doing so. There's a big question about people that are going to be released with terrorism-related offenders in our society right now, and I won't get into that because I have a very short time left. So what I do right now is I run an organization, the co-founder of an organization, interestingly enough, with the NYPD Director of Intelligence that monitored me for 7 years of my life and woke up every morning with my file on his desk. It took him a long time to incarcerate me, but he incarcerated me, watched my de-radicalization after he retired, and then reached out to me and supported me as I went public as America's first former jihadist. What we do is we provide a reverse engineering process of violent extremist organizations where we take this understanding that it's a holistic, multidimensional approach that's needed, that you cannot combat a network with a piece of information or a single former like me, that instead only networks can combat networks. And you have to create networks that are built on antithetical principles to hate. And that then when I tell a person that you should change or when I tell a person that you should not join, I can give them an ulterior sense of meaning, purpose, sense of belonging, vision, identity, and camaraderie that extremists offer their recruits. So I end by returning to Rumi that the wound is the place where the light enters you. I cannot overstate how important it is to inculcate when we deal with violent extremism what we are learning in the breakthrough field of trauma-informed counseling, trauma in general. Almost every individual that I work with now, almost every case of collective or individual radicalization has some level of developmental trauma in the background, whatever that may be. It doesn't make an excuse because many people that are traumatized go on to develop post-traumatic growth, not post-traumatic stress. However, we can certainly make our communities more resilient if we think about how violent extremism is not a phenomenon that occurs in isolation, but one that occurs in an entire holistic concept, and we think about it from a multidimensional approach. Trauma-informed care, trauma-informed education, and what we're learning in the realm of trauma, I think allows us to have the tools through which we can see that lens appropriately. Thank you very much.
Now, he was talking fast. There was a lot of big words there right at the last that seemed important. So if you want to learn more about that, you can join Jesse over lunch and ask more questions. If you have questions that you would like to have answered in the moderated session coming up, hold your hand up. We'll get you a card to write those on so that we can follow up. Our next speaker is Tony McAleer. He's a former organizer for the White Aryan Resistance. Tony served as a skinhead recruiter and manager of the racist rock band Odin's Law. After leading these groups, Tony became the co-founder of Life After Hate, a group founded by former extremists who are committed to helping people leave the violent far right and are dedicated to inspiring all people to a place of compassion and forgiveness for themselves and each other. He's also an international speaker and author. His new book is A Cure for Hate, a former white supremacist journey from violent extremism to radical compassion. Tony's going to do a book signing tonight after tonight's session at the evening event, and tomorrow at Spalding University, and tomorrow evening at 1619 Flux. So will you welcome Tony McAleer?
Which one's yours again? Yeah, you have to run the desktop.
And we will have a short break just after Tony speaks for restrooms and coffee.
Yep.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming. My name is Tony McAleer, and I'm a co-founder and board chair of Life After Hate, an organization founded in 2011 to help people leave the violent far right. I'll tell you a little story about how it got founded. 2011, we were at the Summit Against Violent Extremism, and that was a conference put together by Google Ideas, where they brought 50 former violent extremists that had been working towards peace, 30 victims and survivors, because it's crucial that their voices be heard as well, and then about 120 government and NGOs, and they brought them all to Dublin. And you can imagine how strange it was. There was former members of the Irish Republican Army and their Protestant adversaries, the Ulster Volunteer Force. There was a former commander from FARC, the former president of Colombia. You had Baader-Meinhof, Red Brigade, Mujahideen, Al-Shabaab, you name it. It transcended race, faith, ideology, geography, class, and even gender. There was MS-13 and former Crips and neo-Nazis, of which there were several of us. In some of the after sessions, it was like, it literally was a rabbi, a jihadist, and a skinhead walking to a bar. And it was in that environment where you're listening to the personal stories, you know, over a meal and stuff, of how people got drawn into it and how people left. And these stories had common themes and both in and out. And I'm going to share them through my story with you this morning. Nobody is born a neo-Nazi, but we are all born skinheads. And I grew up in a very affluent, middle-class family. My father was a psychiatrist. Maybe that was the issue. And I went to private schools and all of that. I want you to think about who you were at the age of 3 or 4. And if I think about little Tony, I was this curious, mischievous, bright, sensitive, stubborn, a little defiant little guy that was open to the world. And that's sort of the core essence of who I was, and who you were at 3 or 4 is the core essence of who you were. And we go out into the world, and life happens to us, and we learn it's not necessarily safe to be sensitive or open, or sometimes even curious. I had a pretty normal childhood, but when I was 9, I walked in on my father with another woman, and that really rocked my world. You know, the day that God fell off the pedestal. Did anyone remember that happening? When your parents are not gods anymore, they're very flawed humans like the rest of us. And I felt betrayed, I was angry, confused, and that set me off to acting out at school. I went from a grade A student, grade A's and B's, to C's and D's. And the school tried everything. It was an all-boys Catholic school, tried everything to motivate me. They gave me lots of carrots, and in the end settled on the stick. And I got together with my parents, and they agreed that if I didn't get an A or B on major tests and assignments, I was to be hit on the rear end with a yardstick. And I remember the teacher walking down the aisle, handing out the test results, and it was like playing Texas Hold'em. It was like 62, I know what happened. And I'd have to walk down the hallway to that teacher's office. And whether he came in 2 minutes or 10 minutes, I always wanted another minute. You ever been somewhere where you know something really bad's about to happen and there's nothing you can do about it? That was that situation. And you open up the door and I'd go into his little office, and I'd have to put my hands on the desk just like this and look at his nameplate. And then here's another one. Tell me if you heard this one. This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. I'm not sure who that was supposed to comfort, but it wasn't me. And the first time it was 2, then it was 4, then it was 6, and it was never more than 8. And always at the end of 8, I was a blubbering mess, pleading to be out of that situation. And to this day, I do not think that I have ever felt more powerless than I did in that office. And I went from listening to Queen and Elton John to The Clash and the Sex Pistols, and my musical taste was really a reflection of the anger that was boiling inside me. I just want to take a moment here to say that I do not blame anything that I did on my childhood. Everything I did, I chose to do, and I have to take accountability and responsibility for the choices that I made. But I share with you the things that happened in my childhood because so you can understand the lens through which I made those choices. Have you ever been to the grocery store when you're really hungry? You notice you make different choices? I did the equivalent of going out into the world emotionally hungry. And and I made choices which provided perhaps a fleeting moment of satisfaction, but were completely harmful to myself and the people around me. But I don't blame anything on my childhood. I ended up leaving that school, going to boarding school in England, where I got introduced to the skinhead thing out of the punk scene, and in England it was more mainstream. It wasn't really racist. It was patriotic, and there was an element of it that was racist, and but it was very, very mainstream. And then I came back to Vancouver, and I went to my first punk rock show ever. It was Black Flag with Henry Rollins, if anyone cares. And I was standing outside this theater where the concert was, and waiting to go in, and I was 50, was just about to turn 16. And these two skinheads in Vancouver walked down the line, and they see my Doc Marten shoes, which were a dime a dozen in England, but really rare and expensive in North America at the time, so the early 80s. And they stop and they look at my shoes, and they look at me, and then they look at my shoes, and then they look at me, and they go, "What size feet you have?" And I'm literally quaking in my boots. I know why they're asking, because if the size fits, they're going to take them in sort of some, perverse reverse Cinderella thing. And I lied. I said 7.5, and he nudged the other one and said, "No, they wouldn't fit you." And off they went down the street and around the corner. Those two guys became my best friends, because my bullying survival strategy was befriend the bully, become the bully. And when I was with those guys, I was safe because everyone was terrified of them. I wasn't a tough kid growing up. I didn't get in a lot of fights at school. I was more brains than I was brawn. But these guys were tough. And in order for me to have their protection, I had to have their respect. And in order to have their respect, I had to commit all the same violence that they did. That's a picture of me as a skinhead. Notice the happy face. Those are the two guys right there on the bottom. And you can see actually I'm not actually smiling there. I actually felt safe with them. And sometimes there's all kinds of things that we do in order to feel safe. And somebody said to me, "Tony, how did you lose your humanity along the way?" Because to commit all that kind of street violence, you have to lose your humanity. It's not I didn't lose it. I traded it for acceptance and approval until there was nothing left. But just being a skinhead wasn't enough. I had to be a white power skinhead, and that wasn't enough. I had to be a neo-Nazi skinhead. I had to keep pushing the envelope, and every time I went deeper, I got more and more notoriety. I mistook fear for power, and I got more attention, acceptance, and ended up down at Aryan Nations in Idaho. And I got power when I felt powerless. I got attention when I felt invisible. And I got community and acceptance when I felt unlovable. And those are the vulnerabilities that make people susceptible, not so much to the ideology, but what comes with the ideology, and that's the brotherhood, the camaraderie, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, to be able to go from zero to hero, to have nothing going on in your life, and all of a sudden you're going to be at the forefront of some grand revolution to save the white race from extinction, and Viking imagery and the Third Reich and all of that stuff. But what creates those vulnerabilities? And it's similar to what Jesse was talking about. And I want to stop here and just talk a little bit about toxic shame. Now, healthy shame is a good thing. It lets us know that we've crossed our own values and things like that, like guilt. The difference between healthy guilt, healthy shame, and toxic shame is the difference between I did bad and I am bad. And toxic shame is an impaired sense of self. It's the feeling really deep in our subconscious self-identity system. It's an alienation of the self, where we feel that we're flawed, we're not good enough, we're weak, we're powerless. And we live our lives in reaction to that. So the way that toxic shame expresses can be one of two pathways, and there's multiples of that. One is we project our shame onto other people. The other way is that we internalize our shame. So, I'm just going to read this quote here. Trauma leaves us with a belief system that forms part of our identity. We pick up the belief that we aren't lovable enough, smart enough, that we're powerless and weak, and we go out and live our lives in reaction to that. So, toxic shame is the root of addiction. Addiction is a way to numb the shame, to numb the pain. What I did is I projected my shame onto other people. What's a word that's the opposite of shame? Pride. Proud boy. I'm proud of my race. I gravitated to an ideology that told me I was greater than. That's kind of how this can work. Now, I'm not the first person that grew up in a house with adultery, and I wasn't certainly not the only person on the planet that was beaten at Catholic school. So it's a lousy predictor. It doesn't mean that I'm going to join a violent extremist group. But if you look into the histories of people that join gangs, people with addiction, people, there's a whole spectrum of antisocial outcomes that come out of shame. You'll find shame in the toxic shame in the background. When we look at the young men that were arrested for the ISIS attacks in Brussels and Paris, you didn't find Islamic scholars there. You found troubled youth with criminal and drug histories. It's that toxic shame creates the vulnerability. And it doesn't, the University of Maryland did a study, and the number one factor in the history of somebody joining a violent extremist group was physical or sexual trauma, childhood trauma. And what does that trauma do? It creates the toxic shame and the vulnerability. You can get that toxic shame without physical or sexual trauma. And emotional trauma is something that's often overlooked. You can have abandonment, neglect. There's all kinds of, well, on the surface would be non-traumatic ways to pick up emotional trauma. And so it's an important piece. So I found myself in the depths of the white supremacist movement. I was on Montel Williams' show twice, and I was an articulate Holocaust denier, and went to the Supreme Court of Canada twice with my phone line. All the way just feeding my narcissism, feeding my ego. And if you'd have met me then, I would have presented to you like a sociopath. Because I didn't care about anyone else but me, and I didn't care who I hurt in the way, on my path to aggrandizing myself. So how did that change? It's a pretty awful place to be when you're surrounded all the time with angry, negative people and involved in toxic ideology. It's draining. It's impossible to be happy in that place. But we can become so tied. For me, ideology and identity were intertwined. It wasn't something that I believed in. It's something that I was. It was who I was, not what I believed. But I'll tell you what changed me, and it's a quick story. My mom, me and my brother had a nickname for my mom. She was called the Beak. I don't know if you ever had a mother that would peck and beak at you. And she was from English. I was born in England. She was be like, Tony, don't go out with her. She'll ruin your life. She's horrible. She'll get pregnant on you. Don't go out with her. She'll ruin your life. She'll ruin your life. And I'd be like, all right. Pecking at me. And I had a skinhead girlfriend, and my mom hated her, and that's what she would say to me. And she got pregnant, of course, right? My mom was right, and I should have listened to her, but I wasn't. It wasn't going to happen at that point in my life, and I was terrified to tell my parents that she was pregnant, because guess what I was going to get? 9 months of, I told you so, I told you so. and so we went to family dinners, and she carried low and wore baggy sweatshirts, and we had Christmas, Easter, we had the obligatory family dinners, because I was pretty estranged from my father was bombed by the Germans during World War II, so it's an interesting way to be angry at your dad, to have the guy who sent the bombs a picture on your wall. And so it comes time where I've got to call them and tell them, and so I pick up the phone. Yeah, hi, Mom, it's Tony. Michelle's pregnant.
Yeah, well, I told you so. I told you ruined your life, you idiot.
She drops the phone in. Remember when phones had cords? So it's bouncing against the wall. She goes off, and all I can hear is a stream of profanity. And I tell you, to this day, I've never heard more profanity come out of the mouth of a middle-aged English woman as I did that day. And then I hear my dad, I hear his heavy footsteps, and he's a psychiatrist, right? It's like, so only what's your mom all upset about? It's like, it's Michelle. She's pregnant. Are you sure? Oh, yeah. He's like, well, how far along is she? 7.5. 7.5 months, she didn't tell us. I said, no, 7.5 minutes apart are the contractions. True story. But that led me to the birth of, and I'm holding, half an hour later, I'm holding this beautiful little fragile baby girl, and I'm terrified we're going to do something wrong, and she's a little scrunchy face like that, and she opens her eyes for the first time, and my face is the first picture her brain's going to take. And I started a process of thawing my heart, because up until this point, my heart was completely shut off, disconnected. I was operating solely from the head, from ego, from narcissism. And I had a son 15 months later. I'm not going to try and tell you that story. But what those children did for me is they gave me an opportunity to open up my heart again, because it's safe to love a child at that age. They're incapable of shaming. They're incapable of ridicule. They're incapable of rejection until they're about 13. That's all they want. And so I was able to, in a safe place, open up again. And what they gave me was my first taste of compassion that I could accept. And when we're compassionate with someone, we basically hold up a mirror and allow them to see their humanity reflected back at them. And that caused me the disengagement and allowed me to leave. My mother, who never gave up on me, she loved me unconditionally. I ended up being a single father when they were the ages of 2 and 4, the children. And while she loved me unconditionally, her relationship with me was very conditional. And so when we come to compassion, it has to be accompanied by healthy boundaries and consequences. Otherwise, it's an invitation for further abuse. And compassion is at the root of our work with Life After Hate. We despise the ideology, we despise the activity, but we don't despise the human behind it. And we have to set up rules and accountability. And it's so important that we call people out, but we also at the same time need to call people in and to bring them back. And we believe that no one is irredeemable. And so we engage in compassion. I'll just give you quickly the three markers for radical compassion. Number one, your practice of compassion must take you outside your comfort zone. I think with the problems that we face today in this country, they are not going to be solved from inside our comfort zones. Number two, compassion is the taking action to alleviate the suffering of another. Radical compassion incorporates social activism so that we don't just alleviate the suffering of the individual, we also try to change the environment which creates or supports the suffering. And number three, and this is the most radical part to radical compassion, is in order to give compassion to others, we must first have it ourselves, and we must mine it from ourselves. The more compassion we can have from ourselves, the more we multiply our capacity to be compassionate with others. If we have compassion for everybody else but not ourselves, it's not compassion, that's ego. When we have compassion for ourselves and nobody else, that's narcissism. When we have that two in balance, and it's that journey to face our flaws, the wrong things that we've done, to look at our wounds and things that we've hidden from our entire lives. When we can do that, it's a force multiplier in our ability to serve others. So I'd like to thank you very much.
It's time for a break now. Thank you so much, Tony. and Rashawn and Jesse. If you have questions that you'd like, grab some of us and we'll get you the cards. We'd like to be back. Let's start back. We're running just 5 minutes behind. Let's try to be back in 10 minutes or so and we'll start the panel session.
Just a reminder, no food or drink is allowed back into the auditorium. Please, no food or drink.
It was some kind of printing Yes, yes. So it's probably not better than I would. Well, oh, it's easy.
If anybody would like to have a card, just in case you have a question that comes up, we'll be collecting them through the panel discussion. Would anyone like to have a card just in case? Okay. Anybody else? Anybody else have a card? All right, well, lunch is coming soon, and it will be good. It will be by Masala Grill. We're excited about that. They're I saw a shot of it earlier today, and they're getting ready for us. But now we're moving into our violent extremist panel discussion. I'd like to have our three plenary speakers move to one of the seats up here at one of the microphones, please. Where are my other two speakers? This might be very directed. Yeah, if you can grab them, that would be good. So, Dr. Jason Abbott is going to be our moderator for this panel. Dr. Abbott joined the University of Louisville in July of 2010 after previously holding positions at the University of Surrey, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and the Department of International Studies, Nottingham Trent University. He is the author or editor of 5 books and over 20 articles and book chapters on issues of democratization, economic development, political economy, regional security in Southeast Asia. He's also currently the director of the Center for Asian Democracy. Would you please welcome Dr. Abbott and the panel back to
Okay, I think everyone will agree that the 3 presentations that we heard from our speakers earlier were fascinating. And what I want to do really by opening my part of the discussion is really sort of try to find a commonality among the 3 that will open the discussion a little bit more. And one of the things that immediately struck me is you all spoke to a greater or lesser degree about the process of identity formation and the role of othering in that process of identification. I think one of the things that clearly we see in the case of the Uyghurs is a process by which they have been identified by the Chinese government as the other, and in that process of identifying them as an other, they are an outgroup that has to be extinguished. They're an outgroup that has to be removed as a threat. They are not part of the in-group of the Han, and therefore they can be treated differently. And I think what both Jesse and Tony show is that in their own lived experiences, they've also felt that process of othering. They've identified with others in society as part of their own journey in creating, in dealing with trauma, in finding security, in finding protection. And so really what I wanted to do was to ask you all to sort of speak to that process of othering that we see so much in society. And I was really struck by one of the things that you both said about turning the lens back to the self, and how that became such an important process of breaking that dichotomy. and then how perhaps Rushan can speak to, how can we address othering on an international scale, lest it create conditions for violent extremism to thrive as a process of that marginalization that occurs when you other a group. So if you could maybe, Jesse, you want to start? And
Sure.
then Rushan and Tony.
Sure. So, I think that there is a natural propensity inside of our neurological underpinnings to otherize, based upon the fact that essentially we're tribal creatures. But I think that the growth and the progression of the human experience has increasingly deconstructed that otherizing. I think one of the greatest values of liberalism, or democracy even, is that it creates pathways for a transitioning of that. I think that increasingly we don't need to look at our situation as if it is constantly getting worse, because it's very easy to look at things that are sort of dividing, as particularly over the recent era. But in actuality, relatively speaking and historically, we are on a continued growth that I think now, 18 years into the war on terror, is actually threatened. And I think that that is really the key to looking at the paradigm through which we're existing right now. The world that we live in is changing rapidly. From a geopolitical perspective, the war on terror really set off a black and a white perspective that the jihadists created in order to try to make us tear ourselves down, right? And the reason that they appeal to those that feel left out and left behind is because they can provide an idealistic and a utopic vision of an alternative that all radical social movements provide. And it's appealing because if the world's unfair to you, then you don't care much about the world sustaining itself and continuing to exist in that way. And really, that's the key in de-radicalization, is to paint in complexities where there is none. The question about looking at yourself and turning inwardly is important, because what you really recognize is that if you can pause in that space between stimulus and response, right? The Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl put it best, I think, when he said there's a space between stimulus and response, and in that space lies your empowerment. In that space lies your ability to pause, and rather than simply be in a bestial mode, so to say, where you're just impulsively and emotionally reacting, and if you're traumatized, you react in a way where it's all fear-based and it's in your amygdala, versus what distinguishes us from the beast, which is the development of our prefrontal cortex, where we're rational, that we have to develop mechanisms where we understand to combat that otherizing, which is intrinsically something very easy to do if we don't think much about things. We have to create mechanisms by which we can get people to pause in that space. You're not going to be able to pause in that space between stimulus and response, however, if you're living in anxiety and fear. And so we were first told that we were supposed to fear the jihadists, and in reaction to it, we went about and we fought another other, and we otherized them in a way that was conducive to the worldview they were trying to impart. But at the same time, we otherized ourselves. And so now we're living in this very difficult conundrum where we've seen domestic polarization, and we're transitioning to be concerned with a domestic threat, right? A domestic threat that in large part and parcel, the attacks of September the 11th helped create the paradigm through which it exists. And there's all these other phenomenon of interconnectivity and knowing that things are interrelated. And so what we see as a consequence of that is not only are we polarized at home, but because we're polarized at home and because we've exhausted so much resource trying to otherize those that otherize, and we have ourselves caught in a spiral going downward where we can no longer project Enlightenment values, democratic values, human rights. We come across flat and as hypocritical. What that does is that creates avenues for activity like the Chinese government that are based on very serious principles. And we're now, if we pay attention geopolitically to the situation in Syria and to things going on around the world, there is a threat of a creeping authoritarianism that poses a risk. And there's very little tools that we have, because essentially we might focus now away from the jihadists and we want to concentrate on the far right. But basically we'll do the same thing that we did with the jihadists, and we're making the same mistakes because we're not able to sit in that space and realize that we feed the narrative of polarization when we look at the problem as if it's outside of ourselves. And so I think that when we think about otherizing, it's really the key. And the value of developing critical thinking and developing universities that are based upon liberal educations is that that's where that space of safety occurs so that a person can really contemplate and recognize and value that. When I ran away to Morocco, I was removed from the network. And so I had myself back again, and I was alone with myself. There wasn't that incubator, there wasn't that echo chamber present. And it was that space that allowed me to, just that little planted seed, where you can see the world, the black and the white, you start to see grays. And then when you start to see grays, you're able to sit with those grays. And those grays, if they exist in the right context, for me it was the Arab Spring, allow you to take a deep appreciation of the reality that the world is not an idealistic world, and it's never going to be an idealistic world, but that there is one thing in the world that you can control and that you can take power over, and that's yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the key to dealing with the phenomenon of individual radicalization and contextual radicalization and societal and collective radicalization is to continue to think about ways where human beings can pause in that moment, process through to the rational, and to create mechanisms where we need safety for our children. Or the reason that our children are susceptible is because we don't have enough programming to create things, just simple things like preschool education. When you look at the correlation between going on to commit crimes, or between going on to commit violence, or going on to have sustainable relations in the future, we can totally see that it's about that nurturing period, right? And I think that it all revolves around being able to look at the other through a space where you're not just a knee-jerk reaction. Mm-hmm. And as much as there might be a problem that we see with the alt-right rising, or the far-right rising, or the phenomenon of Donald Trump, sometimes we otherize as well. Right? And the real thing that is affecting me, and I'll end with this, is that when we came about as the bogeyman and it was the jihadists, in the background the far right was rising, right? And very little concern was there. That suits the objective of the jihadists because it fit their black and white worldview. And now that we're focusing on them, we're making the very same mistakes. We're trying to shut down their ability to speak because we don't like it. Right? When in actuality, we should be countering their ideas with ideas that are more superior. As Einstein said, you can never solve a problem at the same level of consciousness that created it. And so, again, as a society, we have to not look at the other and try to understand the other and how to combat or counter the other. We also, at the same time, have to look at ourselves and sit in that space and attack it at a higher level of consciousness, or there's going to be a continued degradation. And on a personal level, there's a parallel and there's a metaphor there. One thing that I have learned, and it sounds almost metaphysical, almost religious, if you will, is that my life seems to be a projection of what's going on inside. My external reality seems largely to be a projection of the work I'm doing myself, and whether that's a metaphysical, principle in the universe, or whether that's just the simple fact that people that are open to new things and to ideas that are truly progressive or enlightened or liberal gravitate toward putting themselves inside of networks and surrounding themselves with things that are different. But there's not a lot of avenues for that right now currently. And so it's about context, I think.
Rushan, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that in the context of what we're seeing in China. Obviously, the knee-jerk response would be immediate Western condemnation and sanctions and the usual sort of toolkit that we would apply in these situations is going to otherize the Chinese, and the Chinese are then going to be able to play themselves as victims against Western bullying and Western domination, which is part of the Chinese government's narrative already. So how do we avoid that while bringing attention to the othering that the Chinese government are doing in their process of creating concentration camps and trying to eradicate a particular group of people?
I came to the United States in 1989, 26 days prior to the Tiananmen Square massacre. The reason I say this is many of you remember that day, June 4th, 1989. I have witnessed, sitting in the front of the TV, watching the breaking news, how the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army came in the tanks, and they started to shot at the young students. And those are their own students, Han Chinese students in Beijing. Hundreds and thousands of students being killed there. And then the Chinese government again denied all that. And I remember Dan Rather the anchor interviewing the spokesperson for the Chinese communist regime, communist government. And he denied sitting there on the live TV. And when he denied, then rather played the footages of the massacre. And he just sat there calmly, watched that, had a smile on his face, and then turned around and looked at the people and said, with the Western technologies, you are able to produce such a false videos. Now, with 3 million people in the concentration camps, again, the Chinese government is trying to fool the world with their narratives. They are taking the reporters and some government officials, especially they are concentrating on the Muslim majority countries, taking them and give them a tour of those pre-orchestrated, pre-set up camps. It also reminds you, when you watch those video clips, of what happened during the World War II. People are happily playing footballs, singing and dancing around, and speaking, saying that, oh, I'm here voluntarily, I can go home on the weekends, I can call my kids if I want to. All lies. So what can we do against such a disinformation, against the government basically brainwashing the entire world communities with Chinese government propagandas, including using our universities? There are 480 Confucius Institutes in the Western countries. We have like 250, 300 in the United States, including Tufts University and some other main universities. They are teaching in our universities the Chinese narrative of those so-called re-education camps. How do we fight that? We need to start from somewhere, because what's happening to Uyghur people today is not just about the Uyghur people's human rights or survival rights or existence at this point. It's about the Western democracy and the values. It's about our future. Back in July 12th, 22 most Western democratic countries sent a letter to United Nations criticizing the Chinese government's crimes against humanity, what they are doing against Uyghur people. Then Chinese government came up with 37 countries backed China, basically saying what the Chinese government is doing is right because they are defending their national security interest. 2 more countries added to the list. The 22 came up 24. Then, a few days later, the Chinese government came up with 13 more. Make it 50. 50 countries backed the Chinese communist government's crimes against humanity, supporting the totalitarian regimes' treatments against one nation. What if those 50 was 100? What if 150? We have to think about that. The OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, also criticized the Chinese government in December last year, December 2018, releasing a statement. Then next time when they met in UAE in March, 57 Muslim majority member states, 57 countries passed resolution in Organization of Islamic Cooperation, commending, not condemning, commending China to continue with its treatment against the Uyghurs. So we have to think about that. How do we stop that? What I'm doing, I'm running out of words to say. All I can do is go around the world, raise awareness, let people know what is the reality, what is the truth. I have not taken a day off since my sister was taken 13 months ago. I have to double and to triple my efforts to make sure the Chinese government understands that taking my sister, trying to make a threat against my activism is not going to work, because that's all I have left. If I don't fight, if you don't fight, who's going to protect everything we have worked so hard in past 50 years, past 100 years? Thank you.
Thank you, Rushan. Tony, maybe you could speak to your very own personal transformation. You said, you showed how becoming compassionate of yourself played such a pivotal role enabling you to break the cycle and to refocus on the self and end the othering that had been key to your identity in far-right groups. Maybe you could speak a little bit more to that process and what you could perhaps, what you learned from that could perhaps be used more widely in society.
So I believe that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mere reflection of how internally disconnected and dehumanized, right? So it's, there's what's going on within us. It is very much is a projection in our reality of what's going without us. And as I went through the path, the introspection, the journey inwards to, look at all the closed boxes in the deepest recesses of my subconscious, that wasn't fun to do. But I connected again with my own humanity. I began to see and recognize humanity in others. When I was involved in the movement, to me, Jews were like ledger entries. They were logistical, like a Walmart logistical problem. There's so many of this here and it needs to get to there. It was completely dehumanized in the way that I viewed the Jewish people. But now it's totally different because I'm connected to my humanity and I can connect to their humanity, and it's a different connection. And one of the things that struck me as I started to, I went through about 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group counseling, as I did that journey inwards and understood why I made the choices that I made, and I shared with you, some of those reasons, and looked at my behaviors as expressions of shame, right? And then I started to look at people that I had once dehumanized, and when I dehumanized them, I judged them based on their expressions of shame. So like First Nations people in Canada, they're 6% of the population, they're 26% of the prison population, and it's a similar story with the African American population here. And I judged them because they were drunks, they were gangs, they were addicts, they couldn't function in this society. And it took me, then I started to think about their experience and shame. And so I started really, and I touch on it in the book, talking about collective shame. There's what I described for you, what happened to me in my individual narrative, my individual shame, but there's collective shame where you're made to feel less than because of who you are, not what you've done as a group, right? And so I started to look at like the residential schools and the colonization of the First Nations and all of these things where they're told they're savages and all of these things. It's no wonder that that shame is spilling out all over the place in that community, and that collective shame can be responsible for behaviors that create individual shame, and it cascades through generations. It's a cycle that I broke the cycle in my family, but it's a cycle, and it's incredibly deep. So in the African American context in this country, with the history of slavery and systemic oppression and all of that, I think when Harvard did the study, you can look it up online. So they gave these people, college kids, tests, right? And they were multiple choice, so there was no marker bias. And there was 2 versions of the test. And one version had all the demographic information, and the second version, they added a question, and that was check off the box for what race you are. The African American students that had to answer, I'm black, scored significantly less than the African American students writing the same test, machine marked, that didn't have to answer that question. It shows you how insidious and how deep that shame piece is, but I couldn't see it or acknowledge it or be aware of it until I understood my own situation. And so the more I connected to myself and my understanding of that, the more I was able to see it and how it had affected other people. And so I went from judgment based on their shame expressions to compassion and understanding based on not the expression, but the core things. And I think in a society, we've never been more connected through social media, but the type of we've never been more disconnected either. It's not true human connection, and I think we're losing our ability to connect with each other and to connect with ourselves. But the answer to connecting is helping people connect to themselves.
Sure. I think that leads me nicely on to the question I wanted to ask all of you about social media, particularly Jesse, given your role then and now in building networks. If we all agree that the key to breaking these cycles of violence is to build compassion and build networks between groups that are marginalized, between groups that exclude each other, how can we achieve that when social media creates these powerful echo chambers that reinforce those identities? And perhaps, Jesse, you could start with that.
So I think that the fascinating thing about social media is that when it first came out, we had innumerable papers, commentary, and journalist coverage of how it was democratizing our world. Mm-hmm. And it was going to put us in contact with people that were across the globe and make us aware of issues around the world. And it was also going to allow us to communicate with other people, and it was going to open us up to a marketplace of ideas. We can now measure the results of that. Our polarization in our society is largely a reflection of the fact and the reality that, unfortunately, and largely due to the way that social media companies like Facebook design themselves, what happens is you befriend someone and then you become exposed to their friends. So 2 degrees of separation, it creates a reverberatory effect that creates an echo chamber. And the echo chambers that exist isolate you inside of one part of a left and a right divide, or a black and a white divide, where you only hear information about the other that's unnuanced, and you only get information produced by people that agree with you, right? And so what I did say in my presentation that was ultimately important is that one thing that we knew, and one reason that we were able to take, they laughed at us when we started promoting Osama bin Laden's views in the United States. They said that American Muslims aren't going to be susceptible to this idea because in comparison to their Western European counterparts, they're more educated, they make more money, right? And they're better assimilated because of the American system, right? The problem is that it's not just about the vulnerable who are poor and that are weak and that feel oppressed and that feel unassimilated, right? It's a vision of a world that's greater than itself. And 9/11 made Al-Qaeda viral because it happened in the real world. It was an expression of their own toxic collective manifestation of their own internal fears and their own sort of black and white world that they had, grown accustomed to, first in Saudi Arabia for Osama bin Laden, and then at war in Afghanistan, and then after that as a result of the fitna or the tribulations that followed. So what we need to look at is we need to look at mechanisms to take people who are isolated online and give them real world activity. I work with a woman who produced an incel podcast right now. Involuntary celibates are individuals that are basically they feel like women don't look at them attractive enough, and they resent boys that can have sex with girls, and they isolate themselves, and they've created this counterculture. 9 people have gone on to become mass shooters from that community, right? But we go into that community and we see a woman who's doing this podcast, and we say, oh, you have inside access to that community. We're not going to demonize that community, because in reality, those 9 people are not representative of the entire community, but the journalists and the people on a particular side cover it that way. They conflate the problem. And this is a phenomenon that we see with a reaction to the other everywhere. A reaction to any radical group, because one is isolated individual does not represent a very low base rate of radicals go on to become violent extremists. What have we done? We've applied a different philosophy. We've established relationship with the administrators in their forums. Those administrators are willing to agree with us that individuals in their forums do pose different perspectives. They follow a particular ideologue, or they use a particular word that is an indicator of risk. We're able to have them identify them for us, and then we're able to go out and to try to approach them in private chat and in a one-on-one engagement in isolation, where we can pull them out and we can talk to them. Even if we don't get them to leave the radical group, the objective should be to get them not to transition to violent extremism. But dealing with that, we have to look at how did they get there in the first place. These are the kids that sat in school that nobody paid attention to, right? These are the individuals that became the gamer, right? Because it gave them a sense of community because of the interactivity of the platform, but they have no real world activity. What made us powerful was that we were active in the streets, and we had cameras everywhere we went, just like ISIS. ISIS pays their journalists that are going to transition into their social media about 7 times more than the average fighter in the field that's putting their life at line, because they understand the power is the idea, right? And so social media needs to become a tool, and we need to develop tools holistically where we can make social media awareness spread on social media, because we sometimes also see the world through a very democratic lens, where it's like majorities have to believe in something in order for change to occur. But real change and real reality of measuring things looks at network science and looks at there's hubs and there's key nodes in any network that are so much more influential. They have an 80-20 rule, where 20% of the nodes in a network produce 80% of the output. And if you can shift the behavior and the attitudes of those nodes, then in a sense you can shift the network. And so we think in terms of that. That's what we do at Parallel Networks. We're not worried about the edges of radicalization. We're worried about the hubs and the nodes. And just like Rasha said, 50 countries signed on at first, and more have signed on agreeing with the Uyghur persecution. Many of them are Muslim. Why? Because they're persecuting their own people. But why is it able to occur? Because the United States itself, they can always just point to Guantanamo Bay. They can always just point to the war in Iraq. They can always just point to the inherent contradictions inside of our own selves. And so what we have to do with regard to that understanding of social media is first we have to understand how it works, which we don't, right? We don't understand it very well at all. And there's many reasons for that, one of which is it requires us first to look at our own way we use social media and the way the social media companies design social media. Its intention is ultimately to gauge our consumption and to sell us things, right? Rather than to have a sort of principle-based, value-based approach to the way that we do things. And they've largely helped to create a problem. So I mean, from the level of the companies themselves to the level of government involvement to the level of university to the level of individual NGOs like Life After Hate, Parallel Networks, the activists like Rasha, we have to get people upon a level of addressing the problem at a higher level of consciousness and creating networks that are antithetical to hate and extremism, but that pull people out. But it's conversations like these. It's being able to step away and become aware of what Tony said about the online reality, and to look for opportunities in our life to approach the people that we're fearful of or that we think won't talk to us, or the people that we might hate. And if you have a conversation with someone that you're otherizing, I guarantee you a large portion of the time you're going to come away with at least a piece of gray that allows you to understand that, wow, they're bad. And I still think they're bad, but they're still a human being, right? And so we need to make, and each of us can do it, we can make opportunities for ourselves to engage consciously. And social media can become a tool to do that if we look at it that way. It's just about awareness. We deal with a lot of millennials, and now that I've grown an organization that's actually functioning, we deal with a lot of millennials, and it's very, very, very serious, their inability to engage, I think, in the real world. So we're looking at this at a generational level where it is really difficult for this generation because they grew up with social media, and now the next generation grew up with the iPad and the iPhone on their hip. But technology is a tool like nuclear energy. Nuclear energy can power entire cities, it can power entire countries, it can also be used to promote thermonuclear war, right? I just think that there's an awareness, and we need to look at it as a tool, and we need to be concerned with what we're doing with it. And it doesn't take a lot, if you look at the world through a lens of networks and nodes and key hubs, to impact an entire group of people by impacting one particular component of that network itself.
Okay, I have a few questions that have come in from the audience. I start with Rushan. Somebody asked a very simple question, which I'm sure has an incredibly complex set of answers, and that is, what can we do to help and raise awareness as individuals and collectively?
That is a great question. Number one, right now, the most important one is we've got the bill that passed in Senate, but Congress still not putting on the floor for voting. It's called Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act 2019. We still need more than 100 Congress men and women's signatures. So you can call your representatives to support and sign that bill. That's number one. Number two, I can't emphasize enough of the importance of sharing the information on social media and tell your colleagues, friends, families, relatives, anybody, if you are Muslim, ask your imam to speak on the Friday prayers. If you belong to any kind of organization or church or temple anywhere, please speak about it. If you organize any kind of engagement in the events like this, I don't mind flying over wherever I am to come and speak and talk about this. And we do have some other activists as well. Probably many of you have heard about it, heard about this atrocity. It is the unprecedented atrocity of this century. Secretary Pompeo said it is a stain of the century. Since the World War II, this is the largest of ethnic group is being punished collectively. I'm going to ask, just ask yourselves, I'm going to ask Jesse here, since you know about this atrocity, what have you done on the raising awareness or make your points? Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, when your name was up there, I was just looking at that name and thinking, wow, you would have been in the camp. For your name, all three of them is banned. Yunus, Abdullah, Muhammad, and your beard. If you eat halal food as a Muslim, that is a crime. So basically, China is using Islamophobia and the war on terrorism to punish Uyghurs for being Uyghur, for being Muslim. But you have heard this now, or you have heard before. What have you done to raise awareness? What have you done to stop this? Because what's happening in my homeland is not staying there. Chinese government is exporting to other countries. There are more than 18 countries around the world exported the system. Talked about Guantanamo here. I spent 11 years of my life in Guantanamo. I lived there for 13 months when I was translating for the DOD. everybody went outraged. Still they criticize Guantanamo. Well, people live in Guantanamo. Those people who were labeled as worst of the worst had so much freedom. Believe me, I witnessed. They can pray, they have Qurans, they can fast. For those fasting, eating halal food, praying, having Quran at home, having prayer at home, people are going to concentration camps. Where is the outrage? Where is the outrage that I have seen about Guantanamo on social media, and writing op-eds, speaking? Where are all these activists? Islamic hadith on the brotherhood says that all Muslims around the world are like one body. Any part of that body aches or something happens, the whole body is supposed to react to that. Well, the Uyghur Muslims are being amputated from that body. Where is the outrage? Where is the outrage from my Muslim brothers and sisters? Where is the outrage from Ummah? Like what Jesse said, the governments, yes, I understand, they are siding with China. Among those 50 countries I stated earlier, 16 of them are Muslim majority countries, including Palestine, including Uzbekistan. They all signed supporting China. But what about Ummah? What about the people? Google and the Facebook both are supporting China right now while we speak. Google is developing a dragonfly search engine, censored search engine for Chinese government. Where's the outrage from American public, American people? Facebook, they just announced that they're sharing information with the Chinese government. What we post on Facebook, whatever the names that Chinese government asks. Where is the democracy? Where is the freedom of speech? So what you can do is, as an American, as a people who defend the freedom, speak out. Thank you.
Can I, for 30 seconds, just say one thing? Yunus Abdullah Muhammad actually did address the Uyghur situation in 2010 and 2011. Because we, as jihadists, understood the principle in the hadith, one of the things that makes jihadism really appealing is because it overcomes race and it gets beyond Arab nationalism and the sort of sentiment of racism. The jihadists' #1 major recruitment tool right now, right, one of their major narratives has to do with the Uyghur people. They are certainly doing what Rosh is talking about. And this is true, while LeBron James endorses, essentially, the Chinese government.
I want to give the gentleman in the Health Science Center an opportunity to ask the question of our speakers.
Yes, thank you. I guess the question would go to earlier development of what United States of America, when you spoke about the OIC, the development. I have a real and interesting question. In Europe, banning of the development of this type of activity of white extremists, looking at Al-Qaeda, looking at different development, do you understand, is there a development of what Bannon is doing in Europe going to affect the Western, if we take a look at some of these development of the white extremists and some of these organizations, this type of fear and this type of animosity, do you understand what Bannon is doing in Europe? How that affects what's going on in America, taking the tools of directing this fear and utilizing it through tools. I just want to understand what the OIC means, because it seems to me it is an underlying, but it's such a magnitude global effect, this type of activity of extremists. I have this question for each one of you there, especially concerning Europe.
Okay, thank you. So, the rise of extremism in Europe and its relationship with the broader extremist movement. Tony, you got involved in the skinhead movement in Europe at one point, and there's a lot of links between the Aryan Nation and extremists in Europe. Maybe you could say something about.
Sure, and you know, there's extremists here in the U.S. With groups like Atomwaffen that are training with Azov Battalion in Ukraine. There always was. This is a global phenomenon in the West. It's not isolated to the United States. The last election is part of a global phenomenon that started with Brexit. It's not something that happened in isolation. And you know, as human beings, we operate from one of two places: love or fear. You know, we get to choose which one. But in times of uncertainty, and I think the migrant crisis, the way it was handled in Europe by Merkel, brought uncertainty. You know, in Canada, we took 35,000 Syrian refugees. I think that was the equivalent if we took 500,000, if you look at the population. But they said, here's where they're coming, this is where they're going, and these are the resources we've set up, and there was a plan. And Canadians just went, okay. There wasn't much pushback to it. But in Europe, she didn't communicate a plan. And in the absence of a plan, you have uncertainty. And when you have uncertainty, you have fear. And you have these groups which capitalize on the fear. And when people feel uncertain about the situation, and that the people in charge or have been in charge for a while don't seem to have a handle on the situation, that's why people vote for authoritarian and for strongmen, because they want certainty. I want someone to come in and give me certainty. And certainty is more important in those times than liberty or freedom or whatever. Those are great when you have certainty. In the absence of those, it's different. So I look at populism, it's an essential part to democracy. And it's like the check engine light going on in your car. It's telling you when things are uncertain, something's going wrong, something's not right. Populism almost never has the right answer, but it often asks the right question. And I think there's this underlying uncertainty that's being exploited by political characters on both sides of the water to gain power and to offer that authoritarian solution, strong man or woman, to provide that certainty.
So Steve Bannon, very interesting character for sure. One thing you could look at is a piece of research that was conducted by a team of professors, published as a book called Network Propaganda, where it essentially showed how Breitbart's narrative on anti-immigration and anti-Islam basically not only helped give us Donald Trump, but overtook the narrative of Fox News. The power of social media to infiltrate, the power of mainstream media. And so what we see, we have this notion, what you can see the outcome in violent extremism in differentiating between the growth of radicalization, the low base rate of those that go on to become violent extremists, is when there's a growth of populism and a growth of radicalization, there's acts of more violent extremism, and they're representative of the narrative that becomes predominant. So the Great Replacement is the primary narrative that drove the El Paso shooter, and he did it against Mexicans, but where does it come from? It's actually a French theorist's doctrine that started that was against Muslim immigration, right? And so then what happens with the Christchurch attacker? It's still about the Muslims, right? But now in Western Europe, that's the issue. That's the immigration issue. That ideology goes on to impact the El Paso shooter and others as well. The German, anti-Semite quotes that idea. Well, that Great Replacement theory is largely the anti-immigration theory that was espoused by Breitbart News for so many years. So what's Bannon done now? He's out of Breitbart, he's moved on, and he realizes that there's a need to make the right-wing extremist ideology transnational. So they're going transnational. There's an article about it that was published by a journalist called Lizzie Dearden, a great journalist. She's a very good journalist from The Independent. And she covered my work with Ivan Humble, who's a former right-wing extremist who was radicalized by a preacher that I worked with, in sort of analyzing the transnational nature of this right-wing threat. And finally, we work with a woman from Breitbart News that worked directly under Steve Bannon. She has left the movement. She is part of our program. We provide support to her. And she stated very clearly that Steve Bannon's goals are ultimately to transnationalize those right-wingers in the West so that he can have one coherent ideology that trumps, but at the same time respects nationalism, and that he has a very serious agenda for that. So we're only going to see that pushed further and further down the road.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, and so what I wanted to do is, there's actually one question here that I think all three of you can address in different ways, both personal and movement-wide, and that is, particularly in the case of Jesse and Tony, you spoke about your transformation, and the person here asks, how, even after you've changed, right, how did you turn off the hate? How do you turn the hate off? And I guess in case of extending that to Russia, is how do you oppose a government that does that without hating the people that do that? And if the three of you can respond to that, and that will be the end of our moderated session. So
right, I think first we have to have a little talk about what actually is hate. And I think it's a misunderstood thing. I think hate is, it's not the angry skinhead with a swastika tattoo and a swastika flag screaming at the camera. That's rage. And often hate is often accompanied by rage. And so it often gets confused. Hate is, for me, hate is something cold. It's a cold, dispassionate, it's the butterfly collector that goes to the camp and performs medical experiments on Jews. It's a really cool, cold, it's disconnection. And the best definition of sin that I've ever heard is any thought or deed which separates us from ourselves, our families, society, or God, Fred Ethel, the universe, whatever you want to call her. And so when I look at good and evil, I look at good is total connection, and evil, and hate is in that category, is total disconnection. Mm-hmm. So it's how do I overcome the hate was through connection. So I don't have, there's conditionings and strange thoughts that pop up in my head from time to time, but I'm not my thoughts, and I'm able to observe them and go, I can't believe I used to believe that, and that kind of thing. But it's really by building connection, we create a place in a human being where hate can't happen.
Okay. Well, for me, the process has been one that I've articulated in a sort of simplistic way that we utilize to approach individual and collective de-radicalization now at Parallel Networks, where we'll be launching a magazine with the same title soon that will probably attract an ability for us to come back to cities like Louisville and share what we're doing, which is quite interesting. We call it Control, Alt, Delete, Hate, sort of a play off the alt-right. Control is to control that space between stimulus and response in the way that I was addressing earlier. We can't react to a problem at the same level of consciousness that creates it. Empowerment lies, Viktor Frankl. There's a space between stimulus and response, and your power lies there. Why? He was in a concentration camp. And even then, he was able to look at those that were housing him in those concentration camps as though they were still human beings, and he found empowerment there and legacy there. And then to alt is to alter course. Once you realize that you can't address a problem at the same level of consciousness, we need to create avenues for nonviolent activism and engagement to give the same sort of excitement, purpose, and meaning that extremists offer their recruits. We need to create movements dedicated to addressing concerns that are localized and specific to, like, the problem of the Uyghurs, but that are connected to principles that are global. We build everything on three principles: global democratic identity, creative pacifism, and an enlightened humanism. And then to delete hate is to understand that while we might not see it as an existential threat, while we might not see the liberal world order in danger, in fact, if you take a step back and you look at the variables, the fact that 50 countries can sign on and to support such a sick, disgusting thing that reeks of the Holocaust is because it's occurring in an age where there's a rise of extremism and authoritarianism. And so imparting this idea and first taking it, embodying it ourselves, and doing that work at the level and the stage of control, so that we're imparting an understanding in our societies that each one of us has a role and a skill set and an ability to play a role in an age of intersecting extremisms, to work to delete hate and to come up with ways in our lives where we can do so at a local level, but to think local and global at the same time, is to try to create a movement based upon those three phases of activity.
And Roshan, final word to you.
The current Xi Jinping's totalitarian communistic regime does not represent 1.4 billion Han Chinese people. Many of them are as much as a victim as we are, as you see what's happening in Hong Kong. And also we work closely together with Chinese Democrats as an activist. We work together with Falun Gong victims, and also the Tibetan Buddhas and the other Han Chinese faith groups like Catholics and the Christians. So we have same enemy, the regime, the communist Chinese party or Chinese government is our enemy. So we have to work together with the other Chinese people. I was born and raised there. I had Chinese neighbors, friends, didn't have any problem with them. So that's how I differentiate here. And I think we are running out of time, so I just want to finish with reminding everybody with the vow, never again. And now, the never again is happening all over again on our watch, in front of our eyes. Unless if there is an action to follow that vow, the never again means nothing. So please, please help whatever you can. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank the panel. First of all, Jason, Dr. Abbott, thank you for moderating the panel. Tony, Jesse, and Sean, thank you so much for your contributions. In your program, if you want to eat lunch with one of the plenary speakers, the room is indicated there. Let's see, Tony will be in 254, and Jesse will be in 210, and Rashawn will be in 204.
I'll help.
Where are you? Oh, there you are. We're going to now learn what we need to do to get lunch.
Okay, everyone, you should have your name tag. And on your name tag, because you are SVP'd early, well, according to the deadline, you have lunch on your thing. So you're good. Couple things. We have people who will take you to your class, to the classrooms of where our speakers, our guests will be speaking. Waylee is going to take you to 254. 210, Letitia is going to take you to 210. And Renisha is going to take you to 204. So if you will find them outside, once you get your food, they will help you get to the location that you would like to go. So the food is right outside the door, and you need to start at your left.